The stagecoach pulled into Shafter, Texas on a blazing June afternoon in 1878, and Zachary Preston watched from the porch of his ranch house as dust billowed behind the wheels, his heart hammering with anticipation and dread in equal measure because the woman he had been corresponding with for 6 months was finally arriving to become his wife. He stood tall at 26 years old, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as the coach came to a stop near the town square, and he could see her through the window, her pale face framed by auburn hair, her green eyes wide with something that looked like fear. When she stepped down from the coach, his breath caught in his throat, not just because she was beautiful in a delicate, fragile way that seemed at odds with the harsh Texas landscape, but because even from this distance, he could see the swell of her belly beneath her traveling dress. Zachary walked slowly toward the square, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, his mind racing through possibilities and explanations, while his heart told him to keep walking, to meet her anyway, to hear her story before making any judgments. The driver was helping her with a small trunk, the only luggage she seemed to possess, and when she turned and saw him approaching, her entire body went rigid, her hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach as though she expected him to strike her or yell or send her back on the next coach out of town. But Zachary Preston had been raised by a mother who taught him that kindness was the greatest strength a man could possess, and he had learned through his own losses and hardships that judgment came far too easily to most people. So he stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he met her frightened gaze. "Miss Beatrice Thompson," he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest, and she nodded slowly, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. "I am Zachary Preston. Welcome to Shafter." "Mr. Preston, I must speak with you," she said immediately, her voice trembling but determined, and he could hear the cultured accent of Boston in her words, so different from the rough drawl of Texas. "I need to tell you something before we go any further, and I will understand completely if you want to send me back. I have enough money for the return fare, though it took everything I had saved to get here in the first place." "Perhaps we should talk somewhere more private," Zachary suggested, aware that several townspeople were already watching with undisguised curiosity, and gossip spread faster than wildfire in a small town like Shafter. He gestured toward the general store where there was a small bench outside, shaded by an overhang, and she nodded gratefully, following him with small, careful steps that told him she was exhausted from the journey. They sat down, and Zachary placed his hat on his knee, waiting patiently while she gathered her courage, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down his back beneath his shirt, but he did not rush her, sensing that whatever she needed to say had been weighing on her for a very long time. "I am pregnant," Beatrice finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush, her cheeks flushing red with shame and embarrassment. "The child is not yours, obviously, and I should have told you in my letters, but I was so desperate and so afraid, and I thought perhaps if I could just get here, if I could just escape Boston, then maybe I could figure out what to do. I know this is unforgivable. I know I have deceived you, and you have every right to be furious with me." Zachary took a slow breath, studying her face, seeing not deception but desperation, not manipulation but survival, and he thought about his own sister who had died 5 years ago in childbirth, alone and abandoned by the man who had promised to marry her, and how he had held her hand as she slipped away, her baby daughter dying hours later because there was no mother to feed her. He had carried that grief with him every single day since, and he had sworn that if he ever had the chance to prevent another woman from suffering the same fate, he would take it without hesitation. "Who is the father?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, and Beatrice flinched as though he had shouted at her. "A man in Boston," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He worked in my father's law office. He promised to marry me, and I believed him because I was foolish and naive, and when I told him about the baby, he laughed at me. He said he already had a wife and children, and that I had been nothing more than a diversion. My father discovered my condition 2 weeks later, and he threw me out of the house. He said I had brought shame upon the family name, and that he never wanted to see me again. I had nowhere to go, no money, no friends who would associate with a ruined woman. I saw your advertisement in the newspaper looking for a wife, and I thought perhaps in Texas, far away from Boston, I could start over. I thought perhaps I could tell you the truth once we were married, and you might have some mercy on me. But I can see now how selfish and wrong that was." Zachary was quiet for a long moment, processing her words, feeling anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the man who had used her so cruelly, at the father who had cast out his own daughter when she needed him most, at a society that punished women for the sins of men. He thought about the ranch that waited for him 3 miles outside of town, the empty house that echoed with loneliness, the life he had been building alone for the past 5 years since his sister's death. And he thought about the letters Beatrice had sent him, full of intelligence and humor and kindness, describing her love of books and music, her dreams of seeing wide open spaces, her hope for a simpler, more honest life. "How far along are you?" he asked, and she looked at him with surprise, clearly having expected him to order her back onto the stagecoach immediately. "Nearly 5 months," she answered, her hand moving to her stomach again in that protective gesture that tugged at something deep in his heart. "The baby will come in late October or early November," the doctor said. "And you want to keep the child?" Zachary asked, watching her face carefully, and something fierce and determined flashed in her green eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "I know that makes everything harder, and I know that many women in my situation would give the baby away or worse, but this child is innocent in all of this, and I already love it more than I have ever loved anything. I will do whatever I must to give this baby a good life." Zachary stood up, placing his hat back on his head, and Beatrice's face crumpled, clearly believing this was the end, that he was about to reject her just as everyone else had done. But instead, he held out his hand to her, and when she looked up at him in confusion, he smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and softened the hard lines of his sun-weathered face. "Then let us go find the preacher and get married," he said calmly, as though he had just suggested they go have supper, and Beatrice stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "That child you are carrying deserves a father who will claim it and protect it and love it. And I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would never let another innocent suffer if I could prevent it. We have been writing to each other for 6 months, Beatrice, and I believe I know your heart from those letters. What happened to you in Boston was not your fault, and I will not punish you for the cruelty of others." "But everyone will know," Beatrice protested, even as hope began to bloom in her eyes, fragile and tentative. "They will count the months and they will talk, and it will affect your reputation." "Let them talk," Zachary said with a shrug, his hand still extended toward her. "I have never cared much for what people think, and anyone who would judge a child for the circumstances of its birth is not someone whose opinion matters to me. What matters is that you and this baby have a home and protection and a chance at happiness. I can offer you all of that if you are willing to take a chance on a Texas rancher who spends most of his time with cattle and horses." Beatrice placed her small hand in his larger, calloused one, and he helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly from exhaustion and emotion. Tears were streaming down her cheeks now, but they were tears of relief and disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. And she looked at him as though he were some kind of saint or miracle, when really he was just a man who understood that life was hard enough without making it harder for those who were already suffering. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You do not even know me, not really." "Because it is the right thing to do," Zachary said simply, picking up her small trunk with his free hand as though it weighed nothing. "And because I think that child deserves to know only love in this world, not shame or judgment. Come on now, before you fall over from the heat and the journey. Preacher Morrison should be at the church this time of day." They walked together through the dusty streets of Shafter, past the saloon where men were already drinking away their day's wages, past the general store where Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway with her mouth hanging open in shock, past the blacksmith's forge, where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out in a steady rhythm. Zachary kept his head high and his hand firmly holding Beatrice's, making it clear to anyone watching that this woman was under his protection, and that he would tolerate no disrespect toward her. By the time they reached the small white church at the end of the main street, Beatrice was breathing heavily, her face pale with exhaustion, and Zachary felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Preacher Morrison was indeed in the church, sweeping the floor and humming a hymn to himself, and he looked up in surprise when they entered, his bushy eyebrows rising nearly to his hairline when he saw Beatrice's condition. But Zachary had known the preacher for years, had helped him rebuild his barn after a tornado had destroyed it, had sat with him when his wife died of fever 2 winters ago, and there was respect and understanding between them. "Zachary," the preacher said carefully, his eyes moving between the cowboy and the pregnant woman. "What can I do for you? We need to be married," Zachary said directly, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now, today, if you are willing." Preacher Morrison set down his broom, studying them both for a long moment, and Zachary met his gaze steadily, daring him to ask questions or make judgments. Finally, the older man nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I assume you have good reasons for the haste," he said diplomatically, and Zachary appreciated that he did not push for explanations. "Do you have witnesses? We need 2. "I will find someone," Zachary said, and he stepped back outside, looking around the quiet street until he spotted Tom Bradley, a fellow rancher who Zachary had known since childhood, and Doc Reynolds, who was just locking up his office for the evening. He called them over, explaining briefly that he needed witnesses for a wedding, and though both men looked curious about the rush and about the unfamiliar woman waiting in the church, they agreed readily enough, following him back inside. The ceremony was simple and quick, with Preacher Morrison reading from his worn Bible, his voice steady and warm in the cool interior of the church. Beatrice's hand trembled in Zachary's as they repeated their vows, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, aware of the tears streaming down her face and the way her body sagged with relief. Tom and Doc signed the certificate as witnesses, both of them offering congratulations that sounded genuine despite their obvious confusion, and then Zachary was leading his new wife back out into the late afternoon sun, her hand still clasped tightly in his. "We should get you home," he said quietly, seeing how exhausted she was, how her steps were becoming increasingly unsteady. "The ranch is about 3 miles from here, and I have a wagon waiting at the livery stable. Can you manage a little longer?" "I can manage," Beatrice said, straightening her shoulders with visible effort, and Zachary admired her strength even as he worried about her health. She had traveled over 1,000 miles while pregnant, had faced rejection and abandonment, had put herself at the mercy of a complete stranger, and yet she was still standing, still fighting for herself and her child. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet, with Beatrice sitting beside Zachary on the bench seat, her small trunk secured in the back. The landscape stretched out around them in shades of gold and brown, vast and empty and beautiful in its starkness, so different from the crowded streets of Boston. Zachary pointed out landmarks as they traveled, the creek where he got water for the cattle, the hill where coyotes sometimes howled at night, the old oak tree that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. And Beatrice listened with genuine interest, asking questions about the ranch and the animals and what her life would be like here. "I have about 200 head of cattle right now," Zachary told her, guiding the horses down the familiar path. "I run the ranch mostly by myself, with help from a couple of hands who come by during roundup and branding season. It is hard work, and the hours are long, but it is a good life, an honest life. The house is not fancy, but it is solid and comfortable, and there is plenty of room for a family. I built most of it myself over the past few years." "It sounds wonderful," Beatrice said softly, and Zachary glanced at her, seeing the sincerity in her expression. "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Preston. I know how to cook and clean and sew, and I can learn whatever else needs to be learned. I promise I will be a good wife to you." "Just Zachary," he said, a slight smile crossing his face. "And I am not expecting you to prove yourself to me, Beatrice. You are pregnant and exhausted, and the first thing you need to do is rest and regain your strength. Everything else can wait." When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Beatrice gasped softly, and Zachary felt a surge of pride at her reaction. The house was a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Behind it were the barn and the corrals, and beyond that, the seemingly endless expanse of grazing land where his cattle roamed. It was not grand or impressive by Boston standards. He knew, but it was his, built with his own hands and his own sweat, a testament to years of hard work and determination. He helped Beatrice down from the wagon, noticing how she winced slightly as her feet touched the ground, and he made a mental note to have Doc Reynolds come by tomorrow to check on her and the baby. Carrying her trunk under one arm and offering her his other arm for support, he led her up the steps to the porch and through the front door, watching as she looked around the interior with wide eyes. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table with chairs near the windows. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and orderly, though clearly lacking a woman's touch. A staircase led up to the second floor where there were 3 bedrooms, and Zachary guided Beatrice up the stairs, aware of how heavily she was leaning on him now that they were finally here, and she could let down her guard. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door to the largest bedroom, which had a big, comfortable bed with a quilt his mother had made, a dresser, a wardrobe, and windows that looked out over the front pasture. "I will take one of the other rooms. You need your privacy and your rest, and I do not want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable." Beatrice turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to understand what kind of man would marry a pregnant stranger, and then offer her his own bedroom without expecting anything in return. "You are not what I expected," she said quietly, a small, genuine smile appearing on her tired face. Your letters were kind, but I thought perhaps you were exaggerating, trying to present yourself in the best light. But you really are this good, are you not? I am just a man trying to do right by the people in his life, Zachary said, uncomfortable with her praise. Now, you need to rest. I will bring up some water so you can wash, and then I will make us some supper. Do you have any cravings or foods that make you sick? I am not much of a cook, but I can manage the basics. Anything sounds wonderful, Beatrice said, sinking down onto the bed with a sigh of relief. I have not had a proper meal in days, and the thought of sleeping in a real bed instead of sitting upright on a stagecoach is almost too good to be true. Zachary brought up a basin of water and some clean towels, along with one of his mother's old nightgowns that he had kept stored away, thinking that Beatrice's traveling clothes must be uncomfortable after such a long journey. When he came back downstairs, he stood in the kitchen for a moment, his hands braced on the counter, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. He had woken up this morning as a lonely bachelor, and now he was a married man with a pregnant wife and a child on the way that was not his blood, but would be his responsibility, and he hoped, his joy. He made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, with some dried beef and canned peaches, and when he called up the stairs to Beatrice that supper was ready, she appeared looking more rested, her hair unpinned and falling in soft waves around her shoulders, wearing the white nightgown that was a bit too big on her slight frame. She had washed her face and hands, and some color had returned to her cheeks, and Zachary thought she looked beautiful and vulnerable and brave all at once. They ate together at the wooden table, and Beatrice was clearly hungry, eating with good appetite despite her earlier exhaustion. Zachary asked her more about her journey from Boston, about what she had seen along the way, and she described the various towns and cities, the other passengers on the stagecoach, the endless miles of changing landscape as she traveled further and further from everything she had ever known. She asked him about his family, and he told her about his parents who had died of cholera when he was 20, about his younger sister Sarah who had died in childbirth 5 years ago, about how he had been alone on the ranch since then, working to build something solid and lasting that would honor their memory. "Is that why you agreed to marry me?" Beatrice asked softly, her hand resting on her belly. "Because of your sister, partly," Zachary admitted, meeting her eyes across the table. "I could not save Sarah or her baby, and that has haunted me every day since, but it is more than that. I believe that people deserve second chances, and that children deserve to be loved and wanted, regardless of how they came into this world. Your baby did not ask to be conceived in difficult circumstances, and I will not punish an innocent child for the actions of adults." "What will you tell people?" Beatrice asked, worry creeping back into her voice. "When the baby comes so soon after our marriage, the truth," Zachary said simply, "or at least a version of it. We will say that the child is from a previous relationship, that you were widowed, and that I married you knowing about the baby. It is close enough to the truth that I can say it without feeling like a liar, and it gives the child legitimacy. Anyone who wants to gossip will gossip regardless of what we say, but if we stand together and show them that we are a family, most people will eventually accept it." "You make it sound so simple," Beatrice said with a sad smile. "But I know how cruel people can be, how quick they are to judge and condemn. I do not want my shame to reflect on you." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Zachary said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You trusted someone who betrayed that trust. You found yourself in an impossible situation through no real fault of your own, and you have shown incredible courage in traveling all this way to make a better life for yourself and your child. That is not shameful, Beatrice. That is admirable." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she squeezed his hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me hope when I thought there was none left in the world." That night, Zachary lay awake in one of the spare bedrooms, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around him. But now there was a new sound, the soft breathing of another person in the house, and it made the place feel less empty, less lonely. He thought about the woman sleeping down the hall, about the child growing inside her, and he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for a long time. He had spent 5 years existing rather than living, going through the motions of work and survival without any real joy or connection. And now suddenly, he had a family to care for, people who needed him, a reason to build something more than just a successful ranch. The next morning, Zachary woke early as always, his body attuned to the rhythms of ranch life, and he went downstairs to start coffee and begin the day's chores. He was surprised to find Beatrice already in the kitchen, still wearing the nightgown but with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, attempting to figure out how to work the cast iron stove. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at being caught. "I wanted to make breakfast," she explained, gesturing helplessly at the stove. "But I have never used one quite like this, and I was afraid I would burn the house down if I just started experimenting." Zachary could not help but laugh, a genuine sound that felt rusty from disuse, and he moved to show her how to adjust the dampers and regulate the heat, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she had used to wash her hair. "It takes some practice," he said, demonstrating how to place the wood for the best heat distribution. "But you will get the hang of it quickly enough. I can teach you everything you need to know about running this house and this ranch if you are willing to learn." "I am willing," Beatrice said earnestly, watching his hands with close attention. "I want to be useful, Zachary. I want to contribute to our life here, not just be a burden." "You are not a burden," Zachary said, straightening up and looking down at her seriously. "You are my wife, and that means we are partners in this. Yes, I will need to do the heavy work, especially while you are pregnant, but there is plenty you can do to help once you are rested and settled. For now, though, your job is to stay healthy and safe, for your own sake and for the babies." They made breakfast together, with Beatrice insisting on helping despite Zachary's protests, and they fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side in the morning light that streamed through the kitchen windows. Zachary fried eggs and bacon while Beatrice made biscuits, following his instructions carefully, and when they sat down to eat, the food tasted better than any meal Zachary could remember having in years, simply because he was sharing it with someone else. After breakfast, Doc Reynolds arrived in his buggy, having been asked by Zachary the previous evening to stop by when he had a chance. The doctor was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a professional manner, and he examined Beatrice in the privacy of her bedroom while Zachary waited downstairs, pacing the floor nervously even though he had no real reason to be worried. When the doctor came back down, he was smiling reassuringly. "She is in good health, all things considered," Doc Reynolds reported, accepting the cup of coffee Zachary offered. "The pregnancy seems to be progressing normally, and the baby's heartbeat is strong. She is underweight and exhausted from the journey, but with proper rest and nutrition, she should do just fine. I will want to check on her regularly as she gets closer to her time, but there is no cause for immediate concern." "Thank you, Doc," Zachary said, relief flooding through him. "What should I be doing to help her? What does she need?" "She needs to eat well, get plenty of rest, and avoid stress as much as possible," the doctor said, his eyes twinkling slightly. "And she needs a husband who will support her and make her feel safe, which it seems you are already doing. Congratulations on your marriage, by the way," It was quite the surprise when you showed up yesterday with a bride none of us knew about." "I am full of surprises," Zachary said dryly, and Doc Reynolds chuckled. "That you are. I told Beatrice that if she has any concerns or problems, she should not hesitate to send for me, and the same goes for you. First babies can be unpredictable, and I want to make sure she has the best care possible." After the doctor left, Zachary found Beatrice back in the kitchen, determinedly washing the breakfast dishes despite his earlier instructions to rest. He started to protest, but she gave him a look that told him she needed to feel useful, needed to contribute in whatever small ways she could. So he let her be, instead going outside to tend to his animals and check on the fences in the north pasture. The work was familiar and soothing, and as he rode his horse across his land, he found himself thinking about the future, about what life would look like with a wife and a child, about what kind of father he wanted to be to a baby that was not his by blood but would be his in every other way that mattered. The days began to settle into a routine, with Zachary handling the ranch work and Beatrice gradually taking over more of the household duties as her strength returned. She proved to be an excellent cook once she mastered the quirks of the stove, and the house began to smell of fresh bread and stews and pies, scents that made the place feel like a home rather than just a building. They talked in the evenings after supper, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the vast Texas landscape, and Zachary learned more about Beatrice's life in Boston, about her love of reading and her talent for embroidery, about her dreams of seeing the ocean and traveling to California someday. In turn, Zachary told her about his childhood on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the time he got lost during a storm, and his father searched for him all night, about the pride he felt when he finally bought the ranch outright after years of saving and working extra jobs. Beatrice listened to his stories with genuine interest, asking questions and laughing at the funny parts, and Zachary found himself opening up to her in ways he had never opened up to anyone, sharing fears and hopes and dreams that he had kept locked inside for years. One evening about 2 weeks after Beatrice's arrival, they were sitting on the porch as usual when she suddenly gasped and grabbed Zachary's arm, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. "The baby is moving," she said breathlessly, placing his hand on her belly. "Can you feel it? It is like little flutters, like butterfly wings." Zachary held very still, his large hand spread across the swell of her stomach, and after a moment he felt it, a tiny movement beneath his palm, so delicate and miraculous that his throat tightened with emotion. This was a real child, a real person growing inside Beatrice, and in a few months that baby would be here in the world, looking to him for protection and guidance and love. The enormity of that responsibility was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I feel it," he said quietly, his voice rough with feeling, and when he looked up at Beatrice, he saw that she was crying, tears streaming down her face as she smiled. "That is amazing." "I was so afraid," Beatrice admitted, keeping his hand pressed to her belly. "I was so afraid that I would never be able to love this baby properly because of how it was conceived, because of all the pain and shame associated with it. But the moment I felt it move, I knew that none of that mattered. This baby is mine, and I love it with everything I have." "It is ours," Zachary corrected gently, meeting her eyes. "That baby is going to be ours, Beatrice. I meant what I said when you first arrived. This child will know only love here, and it will have 2 parents who want it and will do everything possible to give it a good life." Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder, and Zachary put his arm around her carefully, aware that this was the first time they had been physically close since that brief kiss after their wedding ceremony. They sat like that as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Zachary felt something shift between them, a deepening of their connection that went beyond the practical arrangement they had started with. He was beginning to care for Beatrice as more than just a responsibility or a person he was helping, and the realization both frightened and excited him. As summer progressed into fall, Beatrice's belly grew larger, and she began to move more slowly, needing Zachary's help with tasks that had been easy a month before. He was endlessly patient and gentle, never complaining when she had to stop and rest frequently, always ready to carry heavy things or reach high shelves or help her up from a chair. They went into town together once a week to buy supplies and attend church services, and Zachary made it clear through his actions and words that Beatrice was his wife and deserved respect, though he was always aware of the whispers and stares that followed them. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was the first to openly confront them, stopping Beatrice one Sunday after church and looking pointedly at her stomach. "That baby seems quite large for someone who only married 2 months ago," she said with false sweetness, and Zachary felt Beatrice tense beside him. "Beatrice was widowed before we met," Zachary said calmly, stepping slightly in front of his wife protectively. "The child is from her previous marriage, and I am honored to raise it as my own. I hope that clarifies things for you, Mrs. Henderson." The older woman sniffed disapprovingly, but could not say much more without being overtly rude, and she hurried away to spread this new information to her circle of gossips. Zachary felt Beatrice trembling and turned to her with concern, but she was not crying as he had expected. Instead, she was looking at him with such warmth and affection that it made his heart skip a beat. "You did not have to do that," she said softly as they walked toward their wagon. "You could have let me face her alone." "You are my wife," Zachary said simply. "I will always stand beside you, Beatrice. That is what marriage means, at least to me." "It is what it means to me too," she said, slipping her hand into his, and Zachary held it carefully, feeling the calluses that had formed on her palms from helping with household chores, evidence of her determination to contribute despite her condition. As October arrived and the weather began to cool slightly, Zachary became increasingly concerned about the approaching birth. He made sure that Doc Reynolds was aware of the expected timing, and he prepared one of the spare bedrooms with clean linens and supplies that the doctor had recommended. Beatrice was increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching and her feet swelling, and Zachary did everything he could to make her more comfortable, rubbing her feet in the evenings and helping her find positions that eased the pressure on her spine. "I am sorry I am so useless now," Beatrice said one evening, frustrated with her own limitations. "I feel like a cow, slow and awkward and in the way." "You are growing a human being inside your body," Zachary pointed out, his hands working gently on her swollen feet. "That is hardly useless. And you are beautiful, not awkward. I hope you know that." Beatrice looked at him with surprise, her cheeks flushing pink. "You think I am beautiful like this?" "Especially like this," Zachary said honestly, meeting her eyes. "You are strong and brave and full of life, and that baby is lucky to have you as a mother." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Zachary had been trying not to acknowledge, and he realized with sudden clarity that he had fallen in love with his wife. It had happened gradually over the past months, through shared meals and quiet conversations and moments of laughter and connection, until one day he looked at her and knew that his life would be incomplete without her in it. The knowledge terrified him because he did not know if she felt the same way, did not know if she saw him as anything more than a kind man who had rescued her from a desperate situation. Before he could say anything more, Beatrice leaned forward and kissed him, a soft, tentative touch of her lips against his that sent electricity racing through his entire body. When she pulled back, her eyes were uncertain but hopeful. "I need you to know that I care for you, Zachary," she said quietly. "These past months have been the happiest of my life, despite everything, because of you. You have shown me what real kindness looks like, what real strength is, and I find myself falling in love with you more every day." "Beatrice," Zachary breathed, cupping her face in his hands, careful not to disturb her precarious balance. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, scared but determined, fighting for your child. I married you to help you, but I would marry you again 1,000 times over because you have brought light and joy back into my life." They kissed again, longer and deeper this time, and when they finally separated, both were smiling through tears of happiness. The baby kicked vigorously between them, as though protesting being squished, and they both laughed, the sound filling the house with warmth. "We are going to be a real family," Beatrice said wonderingly, her hand covering Zachary's where it rested on her belly. "An actual, proper family." "We already are," Zachary said firmly. "We have been since the day we said our vows. Everything else is just details." The baby decided to arrive on a cool evening in late October, when the leaves on the oak trees were turning gold and the first hints of winter were beginning to touch the air. Beatrice had been having mild contractions all day, but she had not mentioned them to Zachary, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily. But when her water broke during supper preparation, she could no longer hide what was happening. Zachary remained outwardly calm, though inside he was terrified, haunted by memories of his sister's death and all the things that could go wrong during childbirth. He helped Beatrice upstairs to the prepared bedroom, got her settled as comfortably as possible, and then rode as fast as he dared to fetch Doc Reynolds from town. The doctor gathered his equipment quickly and returned with Zachary, along with Mrs. Morrison, the preacher's late wife's sister who had experience as a midwife. The labor lasted through the night and into the early morning hours, with Zachary pacing the hallway outside the bedroom, hearing Beatrice's cries of pain and feeling helpless and useless. Mrs. Morrison came out periodically to give him updates, assuring him that everything was progressing normally, that Beatrice was doing well, that it would not be much longer. But each minute felt like an hour, and Zachary prayed more fervently than he ever had in his life, begging God to keep Beatrice and the baby safe, promising anything and everything if they would just both survive this. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the Texas landscape, he heard a new sound, a thin, wavering cry that grew stronger and more insistent, and his heart leaped into his throat. Mrs. Morrison opened the door, smiling broadly despite the exhaustion evident on her face. "You have a son," she announced, and Zachary nearly fell over with relief. "A healthy, strong boy with a good set of lungs on him, and Beatrice is tired but doing well. You can come in now." Zachary entered the room on shaky legs, his eyes going immediately to the bed where Beatrice lay propped up against pillows, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, her face pale and exhausted, and absolutely the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets, and she was looking down at the baby with such love and wonder that Zachary felt his eyes burn with tears. "Come meet your son," she said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, and Zachary moved to her side, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and looking down at the infant. The baby had stopped crying and was making small snuffling sounds, his tiny fist waving near his mouth, his eyes squinted shut against the light. He had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and Zachary thought he was absolutely perfect. "Can I hold him?" Zachary asked, and Beatrice nodded, carefully transferring the precious bundle into his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, and Zachary was terrified he would drop him or hurt him somehow, but the infant settled against his chest as though he belonged there, as though he somehow knew this was his father. "Hello there, little one," Zachary whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Welcome to the world. You are so loved already, more than you will ever know." "What should we name him?" Beatrice asked, watching her husband and son with tears running down her cheeks. "I was thinking perhaps we could name him after your father." "My father's name was James," Zachary said, looking up at her with surprise. "Are you sure? You could name him after your own father despite everything." "My father turned his back on me when I needed him most," Beatrice said firmly. "Your father raised a good, honorable man, and that is the legacy I want for our son. James Preston sounds like a strong name." "James Preston," Zachary repeated, looking back down at the baby. "I think it suits him. Welcome to the family, James." Doc Reynolds checked both mother and baby thoroughly before he left, pronouncing them both healthy and strong, and giving Zachary detailed instructions on caring for them over the next weeks. Mrs. Morrison stayed to help with the initial feeding and to make sure Beatrice knew what to do, and then she too departed, promising to check back in a few days. Finally, Zachary and Beatrice were alone with their son, the three of them in the quiet bedroom as morning light filled the windows. "Thank you," Beatrice said softly as Zachary sat beside her on the bed, little James sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. "Thank you for giving him a name, for claiming him as yours. He will never have to feel unwanted or ashamed because of you." "He is my son in every way that matters," Zachary said, leaning over to kiss her forehead gently. "And you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. I am in awe of you, Beatrice." "I could not have done this without you," she said, reaching for his hand. "Your strength gave me strength. Your love gave me hope. I was so broken when I arrived here, and you helped me become whole again." They sat together like that, the new little family, until James woke and began to fuss for food, and then Zachary discreetly left to give Beatrice privacy while she fed the baby. He went downstairs and made coffee, standing at the window and looking out over his land, thinking about how much his life had changed in the span of just a few months. He had gained a wife and a son, and his heart felt full in a way it had not felt since before his sister died. He had kept his promise to himself, had prevented another woman and child from suffering needlessly, and in the process had found more happiness than he had ever expected. The next weeks were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure, with James proving to be a healthy baby with a hearty appetite and strong lungs that he used frequently during the night. Zachary and Beatrice took turns walking him when he was fussy, and they stumbled through the early days of parenthood with a combination of determination and humor, learning together what their son needed and how to provide it. Zachary proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the tiny infant, singing old cowboy songs to soothe him and rocking him for hours when Beatrice needed to rest. The townspeople gradually accepted the story of Beatrice being a widow, though there were some who clearly suspected the truth and whispered behind their hands. But Zachary and Beatrice presented a united front, their obvious love for each other, and for James making it difficult for even the most determined gossips to maintain their disapproval. Tom Bradley and his wife Sarah became friends with them, coming by to visit and bring gifts for the baby, and Doc Reynolds checked on James regularly, pronouncing him one of the healthiest infants he had ever treated. By the time winter arrived in full force, James was 2 months old and already growing rapidly, his eyes opening wide to take in the world around him, his little hands grasping at anything within reach. Zachary had built a beautiful wooden cradle that sat beside the bed in the master bedroom, which Beatrice and Zachary now shared, their marriage having become a true partnership in every sense. They had grown closer through the shared experience of caring for James, their initial attraction deepening into a profound love built on respect and trust and genuine affection. On Christmas morning, Zachary woke early to find Beatrice already awake, sitting in the rocking chair by the window with James at her breast, both of them bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Snow had fallen during the night, unusual for Texas but magical nonetheless, covering everything in a blanket of pristine white. Zachary joined them at the window, wrapping a blanket around Beatrice's shoulders and looking down at his son, who was feeding contentedly, his tiny hand resting on his mother's chest. "This is the best Christmas I have ever had," Beatrice said softly, leaning back against Zachary's chest. "I have everything I ever wanted, everything I never dared to hope for. A home, a family, love." "I feel the same way," Zachary said, his arms encircling both wife and child. "I had given up on the idea of having a family, of being truly happy again, but you changed everything, Beatrice. You and James brought life back into this house, back into me." "Do you ever wonder about the man who fathered him?" Beatrice asked hesitantly, a question she had never voiced before. "Do you ever resent that James is not yours by blood?" "Never," Zachary said firmly, turning her gently so he could look into her eyes. "James is mine in every way that counts. I was there for his birth. I have been up with him every night since. I will teach him to ride and rope and be a good man. Blood does not make a father, Beatrice. Love makes a father, and I love that boy with everything I have." Beatrice kissed him then, deep and passionate, and James made a small sound of protest at being jostled, causing them both to laugh. "I love you, Zachary Preston," she said firmly. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "And I love you, Beatrice Preston," Zachary replied, using her married name with pride. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." The winter passed slowly, with Zachary working to keep the cattle fed and healthy despite the cold weather, and Beatrice managing the household and caring for James with increasing confidence and skill. They celebrated James's first smile, his first laugh, his first attempts at rolling over, treating each milestone as the miracle it was. Zachary kept a journal, documenting James's growth and development, wanting to remember every moment of his son's childhood. Spring arrived with wildflowers blooming across the Texas landscape, and James was 6 months old, sitting up on his own and babbling constantly, his bright eyes taking in everything around him with obvious curiosity. Zachary often took him outside, showing him the horses and cattle, letting him feel the soft muzzles and hear the various animal sounds, talking to him about the ranch and what his life would be like here. One warm evening in April, Zachary and Beatrice were sitting on the porch with James between them on a blanket, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink. James was playing with wooden blocks Zachary had carved for him, stacking them and knocking them down with delighted squeals. Beatrice had her hand resting on her stomach, and Zachary noticed the gesture, so similar to how she had touched her belly when she was pregnant with James. "Beatrice," he asked carefully, hope rising in his chest, "is there something you want to tell me?" She looked at him with shining eyes, a smile spreading across her face. "I am pregnant again," she confirmed, joy evident in her voice. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything, but Doc Reynolds confirmed it this morning when he was here to check on James. We are going to have another baby, Zachary. This time, it will truly be ours together." Zachary let out a whoop of joy, startling James, who looked up at his father with wide eyes before giggling at the unexpected noise. Zachary pulled Beatrice into his arms, kissing her thoroughly, feeling happiness overflow from his heart. "When?" he asked eagerly. "When will the baby arrive?" "Late November or early December," Beatrice said, laughing at his enthusiasm. "James will be just over a year old, so we will have our hands full. But I am so happy, Zachary. I never thought I would have a chance at a normal family, at more children, and now here we are." "Here we are," Zachary echoed, pulling her close again. "Building our family, building our life together." I could not ask for anything more. The months passed in a blur of activity, with Zachary working extra hard to prepare for the expansion of their family, and Beatrice managing to care for an increasingly mobile and curious James while dealing with the exhaustion of pregnancy. Unlike her first pregnancy, which had been marked by fear and uncertainty, this one was full of joy and anticipation. They talked endlessly about names, about whether they wanted a boy or a girl, about how James would react to having a sibling. James took his first steps in August, lurching across the kitchen floor into Zachary's waiting arms, and both parents cheered and cried with pride. He was a happy, healthy child, always smiling and laughing, clearly secure in the knowledge that he was loved and wanted. He had inherited Beatrice's green eyes and her delicate features, but he had a stubbornness and determination that seemed to come from Zachary, refusing to give up on anything he set his mind to. When November arrived and Beatrice's time grew near, Zachary was less nervous than he had been before James's birth, having been through the experience once already. But he was still relieved when her labor began on a clear afternoon, and progressed quickly, with Doc Reynolds arriving in time to help deliver a healthy baby girl just before midnight. They named her Grace, after Zachary's mother, and she had her father's dark hair and a calm, peaceful temperament that was completely different from her energetic older brother. James was initially confused by the tiny new person who had suddenly appeared in his house, but with encouragement from his parents, he quickly became fascinated with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding time. Zachary and Beatrice watched their children with full hearts, marveling at how their family had grown and evolved from that first uncertain meeting at the stagecoach in Shafter. The years rolled forward, marked by the milestones of their children and the steady growth of the ranch. James grew into a strong, confident boy who loved working alongside his father, learning everything about cattle and horses and ranch management. Grace was quieter but equally determined, with a gift for gentling animals and a deep love of reading that she inherited from her mother. 2 more children followed, another boy named Thomas and then a girl named Elizabeth, and the house that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with noise and laughter and life. Zachary never forgot the promise he had made that first day, that James would know only love in their home, and he extended that promise to all of their children. He told James the truth about his birth when the boy was 10 years old, explaining carefully about Beatrice's first pregnancy and how they had come together as a family. James listened solemnly, then hugged his father fiercely and said that it did not change anything, that Zachary was his real father in every way that mattered. Exactly the response Zachary had hoped for, but had not dared to expect. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary and Beatrice stood on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together, watching their 4 children play in the yard while the sun set over the Texas landscape. James was now 9, already tall and strong, helping Thomas build something with spare wood. Grace was 8, reading a book to little Elizabeth, who was 4 and listening with rapt attention. It was a scene of domestic happiness that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked softly, leaning against Zachary's shoulder. "Taking a chance on a pregnant stranger who showed up on a stagecoach?" "Not for a single moment," Zachary said firmly, wrapping his arm around her waist. "You and our children are the best things in my life. I thank God every day that you had the courage to come to Texas, that you trusted me enough to let me help you." "You did more than help me," Beatrice said, turning to face him, her eyes still as green and beautiful as the day they met. "You saved me, Zachary. You gave me back my life, my hope, my future. And you gave James a father who loves him unconditionally, who never made him feel like he was anything less than a true son." "Because he is my true son," Zachary said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just as all of our children are ours, equally loved and equally precious. That is what family means." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Zachary held his wife close and watched their children play, feeling a profound sense of contentment and gratitude. The ranch had prospered, growing from 200 head of cattle to over 500, and they had built a respected name in the community. But more important than any material success was the family they had created together, built on a foundation of love and acceptance and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. James came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, can we go riding tomorrow? I want to show Thomas how to check the fence line like you showed me." "Of course," Zachary said, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "You are getting to be quite the rancher, James. I am proud of you." "I want to be just like you when I grow up," James said seriously, and Zachary felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I want to run this ranch and take care of my family the way you take care of us." "You will do even better than me," Zachary assured him. "You have a good heart and a strong spirit, and you will do great things." As James ran back to join his siblings, Beatrice squeezed Zachary's hand. "He worships you," she said softly. "All of the children do. You are exactly the kind of father I hoped you would be when I first arrived here, scared and pregnant and desperate. And you are exactly the kind of woman I hoped existed, but thought I would never find," Zachary replied, kissing her temple gently. "Strong and brave and full of love. You made me want to be a better man, Beatrice, and you gave me a reason to build something lasting." They called the children inside as darkness fell completely, gathering them around the table for supper, and the conversation was lively and full of laughter as each child competed to tell their parents about their day. After the meal, they sang songs together while Beatrice played the piano that Zachary had bought her for their 5th anniversary, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys while their children's voices rose in harmony. It was a scene of perfect domestic happiness, the kind that poets write about and artists try to capture, but it was real and tangible and theirs. Later, after the children were all tucked into bed, Zachary and Beatrice stood in the doorway of each room, looking down at their sleeping sons and daughters, their hearts full of love and pride. In James's room, Zachary paused longer, watching his eldest son sleep peacefully, his face relaxed and innocent in slumber. He thought about the scared woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago, about the decision he had made to marry her despite knowing she carried another man's child, and he knew without any doubt that it had been the right choice, the best choice he had ever made. "What are you thinking about?" Beatrice whispered, slipping her hand into his. "About how blessed I am," Zachary said honestly. "About how one decision changed my entire life for the better. About how glad I am that you had the courage to answer my advertisement, even though you had every reason to be terrified. I was terrified, Beatrice admitted, but I was also desperate, and sometimes desperation leads us to exactly where we need to be. I took a leap of faith, and I landed in the arms of the best man I have ever known. They went to their own bedroom, closing the door quietly behind them, and as Zachary held his wife in his arms, he thought about the promise he had made all those years ago, that James would know only love in their home. He had kept that promise every single day, and he would continue to keep it for the rest of his life, extending it to all of their children, teaching them through example that love was stronger than blood. That family was built through choice and commitment and daily acts of kindness. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges as they raised their children and managed the ranch. There were hard winters when cattle died and money was tight, and hot summers when drought threatened their livelihood. There were illnesses and injuries, moments of fear when one of the children fell from a horse or came down with fever. But through it all, Zachary and Beatrice faced each challenge together, their love for each other and for their children never wavering. James grew into a fine young man, strong and capable, taking on more responsibility for the ranch as Zachary's hair began to show threads of gray. He courted and married a local girl named Catherine when he was 21, and Zachary and Beatrice became grandparents to a robust baby boy who James named Zachary, after the man who had raised him with such love and devotion. At the christening, James stood with his son in his arms and publicly thanked Zachary for being the best father a man could ask for teaching him what it meant to be honorable and kind, and there was not a dry eye in the church. Grace married a schoolteacher from a neighboring town, a gentle man who loved her intelligence and quiet strength, and they settled nearby so she could remain close to her family. Thomas took over more of the daily ranch operations as Zachary slowed down, and young Elizabeth showed a talent for training horses that impressed everyone who saw her work. The Preston family became a fixture in Shafter and the surrounding area, respected for their honesty and integrity, known for their willingness to help neighbors in need. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Zachary and Beatrice renewed their vows in the same small church where they had been married so hastily all those years ago. Their 4 children stood up with them, along with several grandchildren, and the church was packed with friends and family who had come to celebrate their enduring love. When Preacher Morrison, now quite elderly but still performing ceremonies, asked if they wished to speak their own vows, Zachary turned to Beatrice and took both of her hands in his. 25 years ago, a scared but courageous woman stepped off a stagecoach carrying a secret that could have destroyed her life, Zachary said, his voice strong and clear so everyone in the church could hear. I made a choice that day to offer her my protection and my name, and in return, she gave me everything I had been missing: love, family, purpose, joy. Beatrice, you have been the best wife a man could hope for, the best mother our children could have asked for, and my dearest friend through every season of life. I promise you now what I promised you then, that you and our children will always know only love in our home, and that I will spend every remaining day of my life trying to deserve the gift of your love. Beatrice was crying openly, as was most of the congregation, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Zachary, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope when I had none, dignity when I had been stripped of it, and love when I thought I was unworthy of being loved. You have been the most amazing father to all of our children, never making any distinction between them, loving them all equally and completely. You kept your promise about James, that he would know only love here, and that promise has shaped every aspect of our family. I love you more today than I did 25 years ago, and I will love you for whatever time God grants us together." They kissed to thunderous applause, and the celebration that followed was joyous and long, with food and music and dancing lasting well into the night. James gave a toast to his parents, his voice breaking as he thanked Zachary publicly for claiming him as a son, for never making him feel like he was anything other than a true Preston. The love in the room was palpable, a testament to the family that Zachary and Beatrice had built through patience and commitment, and unwavering devotion to each other and their children. As they grew older, Zachary and Beatrice gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to James and Thomas, spending their time instead with their growing number of grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom from their years together. They remained devoted to each other, still sitting on the porch every evening to watch the sunset, still holding hands like newlyweds, still finding joy in the simple pleasure of being together. When Zachary was 55 years old, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter, and for several terrifying days, Beatrice sat by his bedside, refusing to leave, holding his hand and praying with a fervor that rivaled her prayers during James's birth. Their children gathered at the ranch along with many grandchildren, all of them waiting anxiously for news. But Zachary was strong, and with Doc Reynolds's care and Beatrice's devoted nursing, he pulled through, emerging thinner and weaker but alive. "You scared me," Beatrice scolded gently when he was finally well enough to sit up and eat solid food. "I thought I was going to lose you, and I realized that I am not ready to face life without you. You are my heart, Zachary Preston." "And you are mine," Zachary said, squeezing her hand weakly. "I am not going anywhere yet, love. We still have grandchildren to spoil and years to spend together." True to his word, Zachary recovered his strength over the following months, and life returned to normal. He moved more slowly now, and the work of the ranch was firmly in the hands of the next generation, but he was content with his life, satisfied that he had built something lasting and good. He had kept his promise to himself and to Beatrice, had raised James with all the love and devotion any son could wish for, and had created a family legacy that would continue long after he was gone. On a warm spring evening 30 years after Beatrice had first arrived in Shafter, Zachary and Beatrice sat on their beloved porch, watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build. They were in their 50s now, their hair mostly gray, their faces lined with the marks of years lived fully and well. Around them, the ranch bustled with activity as their children and grandchildren went about their evening routines, the sounds of family life filling the air. "Do you remember that first day?" Beatrice asked softly, leaning her head on Zachary's shoulder. "When I stepped off that stagecoach, pregnant and terrified, and you walked toward me without judgment in your eyes." "I remember everything about that day," Zachary said, his arm around her waist in the familiar gesture that had become second nature over the decades. "I remember thinking that you were brave and beautiful, and that I wanted to help you. I remember feeling a pull toward you that I did not fully understand then, but recognize now as the beginning of love. You changed my life completely," Beatrice said, turning to look at him with eyes that still held the same love and devotion they had shown on their wedding day. "You gave me everything, a home, a family, dignity, love. But most of all, you gave James the gift of knowing he was wanted and loved, of growing up without shame or stigma. That was the greatest gift you could have given me. James turned out well because he had you as a mother," Zachary said firmly. "Your strength and courage shaped him just as much as anything I did. We raised him together, and we raised him right." As if summoned by the mention of his name, James appeared on the porch, now a man of 30 with his own children, strong and capable and radiating the confidence that came from knowing he was loved. He sat down on the steps, joining his parents in watching the sunset, and after a moment, Grace and Thomas and Elizabeth joined them as well, along with several grandchildren. It became a family gathering without anyone planning it, all of them drawn together by the bonds of love that had been forged over years of shared life. "Tell us the story again," one of the grandchildren requested, a girl of about 8 who had heard the tale before but never tired of it. About how Grandma and Grandpa met. Zachary and Beatrice exchanged glances, smiling at the request they had heard many times over the years. It had become a family legend, the story of how they came together, and they never refused when asked to tell it. "Well," Zachary began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It was a hot June day in 1878, and I was standing on this very porch, waiting for the stagecoach to arrive from the east. I had been writing letters to a woman in Boston, and she had agreed to come to Texas to be my wife, though we had never met in person. When the coach pulled up and she stepped out, I knew immediately that my life was about to change forever." "Grandma was pregnant with Uncle James," the little girl said, wanting to be part of the story, and Zachary nodded. "She was," he confirmed, seeing James smile at the mention of his origins. "And she was very scared because she thought I would send her away when I found out. But I had learned that love is more important than circumstances, and that every child deserves to be wanted and loved. So I asked your grandmother to marry me that very day, and she said yes, and we have been together ever since." "And they lived happily ever after," Beatrice added, taking Zachary's hand. "Because sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, built on love and commitment rather than just blood. Your Uncle James is proof of that, as are all of you." James stood up and came to embrace both of his parents, his eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly, words he had spoken many times but still meant with his whole heart. "Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for making me part of this family. I hope I have made you proud." "You have exceeded every hope I ever had," Zachary said firmly, hugging his son tightly. "You are a good man, a good father, a good husband. You are everything I could have wished for in a son." As the evening wore on and the family gradually dispersed to their own homes and bedrooms, Zachary and Beatrice remained on the porch, reluctant to end the perfect day. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Texas sky. "I meant what I said at our vow renewal," Zachary said eventually, breaking the silence. "You gave me everything I had been missing. Before you arrived, I was just going through the motions of life, existing but not really living. You brought joy and purpose and love back into my world." "And you gave me hope when I had none," Beatrice replied, squeezing his hand. "You showed me that there are good men in this world, men who keep their promises and protect those who need protecting. You taught me that love is a choice we make every day, not just a feeling that comes and goes." "I choose you," Zachary said softly, turning to face her in the starlight. "Every day for the past 30 years I have chosen you, and I will continue choosing you for however many days we have left." "And I choose you," Beatrice echoed, leaning in to kiss him gently. "Always and forever." They sat together under the stars, two people who had taken a chance on love 3 decades ago and built something beautiful and lasting from that initial leap of faith. The ranch house behind them was quiet now, filled with children and grandchildren sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and wanted. It was everything Zachary had dreamed of when he first placed his advertisement for a mail-order bride, everything Beatrice had hoped for when she gathered her courage and boarded that stagecoach heading west. The promise Zachary had made on that first day, that James would know only love in their home, had been kept faithfully every single day since. It had expanded to encompass all of their children and grandchildren, becoming the foundation on which their entire family was built. Love, not judgment. Acceptance, not rejection. Hope, not despair. These were the values that defined the Preston family, passed down through generations, a legacy more valuable than any amount of land or cattle. As they finally went inside to bed, Zachary's arm around Beatrice's waist, supporting her up the stairs they had climbed together thousands of times, both of them knew with absolute certainty that they had made the right choices all those years ago. The scared woman on the stagecoach and the lonely rancher on the porch had found each other at exactly the right moment, and together they had created something extraordinary. A family built on love, a home filled with joy, and a life well lived. In the morning, they would wake to another day of ranch life, another day of children and grandchildren, another day of the simple pleasures and routine challenges that made up a life. But tonight, as they fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for 30 years, they were simply two people who had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances and had nurtured it into something that would last for generations to come. The mail-order bride who arrived pregnant from another had found a home, and the cowboy who had said her child would know only love there had kept his word, creating a legacy of acceptance and devotion that would endure long after both of them were gone. A testament to the transformative power of unconditional love and the profound truth that family is defined not by blood alone, but by the choices we make and the love we give freely to those who need it most.